I want today to revisit the Enron case and talk a little bit about the nuts and bolts of what was going on there. Okay, so if you haven't seen the PowerPoint presentation on Blackboard, you can pull that up for reference. Come on in here. I have not gotten the video up yet from Monday's class session. The Enron case is instructive because this is a case where the company, which was a midstream pipeline company, wanted to grow really quickly. And to grow really quickly and to branch out into other operations, including especially natural gas futures trading, but also electricity grid provision, and various other integrated operations in the oil and gas space. To do this, they needed leverage. And so they began accumulating debt. Now, just like for personal debt, in the corporate world, there are credit ratings. Okay, just like when you take out a mortgage, first thing that the bank looks at is your credit rating and assesses your worthiness as a borrower based on that score. So also in the corporate world, there are credit ratings provided by agencies like Moody's or Fitch's or Standard & Poor's. They range from the very best credit ratings, like Apple has a AAA. Actually, it's got a higher credit rating than the American government. All the way down to junk bond status and companies that are expected to be very close to default. Enron wanted to grow quickly. To do that, they needed leverage and they needed to borrow money. But at the same time, they didn't want their credit rating to go down. They wanted to advance up the scale. And as you know, with personal credit, the more money you take out, the more that's seen as putting you at risk as a borrower. And the greater is the potential liability that the bank faces. Okay, Enron was largely looking at secured borrowings, just like in personal credit. There is, in the corporate world, secured and unsecured credit. You have, as personal loans, most of us do, credit cards, which are unsecured, and so your insurance rate each month, if you don't pay it off each month, is a relatively high number. But there are also, in the personal credit world, secured loans, mortgages, auto loans, etc. In the corporate world, there are secured and unsecured loans. Companies have loans that are backed by their assets and loans also that are just revolvers, just like we personally have. Enron primarily was borrowing on a secured loan basis, and they used two devices aggressively in the accounting world. One was mark-to-market accounting, which is a standard operating procedure in a lot of accounting. But they used mark-to-market accounting very aggressively. Okay, when you evaluate the value of an asset on a balance sheet, it's good practice not to assess the value of the asset to be what you originally paid for it, but rather what it would likely fetch in the current market conditions. Okay, you may have bought a car a few years ago for a particular price, but that car on your personal balance sheet is not, of course, going to be worth that now. It's worth much less because a car is a depreciating asset. Okay, the old adage is if you drive a new car off the lot, it's worth $2,000 less. The minute you drive it off, you should never buy a new car, ever. Always make sure it's at least 6 months old. For Enron, they used mark-to-market accounting, which usually signals depreciation of assets, but they used it very aggressively to signal appreciation of assets. Some corporate assets do appreciate the longer they're held on the balance sheet, just like what some personal assets do appreciate. A house, for instance, is usually, not always, but usually an appreciating asset, unlike a car. Okay, both of those assets don't lose value at nearly the rate that some personal items lose value at. Clothing, apparel is an example of a personal item that depreciates massively, very rapidly, as soon as it's purchased. Enron would find and purchase from another company an oil and gas deposit, maybe in the Permian or in the Eagle Ford or something like that, and then they would pretend that it was more valuable than it in fact was. They would mark up the value of the asset. Maybe they pretended that more oil and gas was found or deposits in the particular play. Okay, and they did this for a variety of different assets across their balance sheet. So whereas they may have purchased it, a particular asset, for $2.5 million, they would mark it up on their balance sheet over time to $3.3 million or whatever, in order to look like a more worthy borrower in the eyes of the creditors that they were attempting to lever up from. And this was to lower their interest rate so they could expand rapidly. Again, at the heart of this was a psychology, a mindset of rapid expansion, corporate greed that kind of ran away with itself. Rapid expansion so as to increase the stock options and potential salaries of the executive team. That was what was driving all of this. Mark-to-market accounting was then used in order to fabricate a particular view of Enron's assets to make the market, the creditor market, believe Enron to be a more stable company than it in fact was. Okay, and Ken Lay, the CEO of Enron, famously held a press conference shortly before the end saying that Enron's finances have never been sounder, the day that he actually dumped his entire Enron stock portfolio. Okay, we found that out later. Also aggressive was Enron's use of SPEs. SPEs are just special purpose entities. Imagine this is Enron. They set up approximately, if I remember right, 65 special purpose entities, all of them subsidiaries that were dependent upon Enron in various capacities, and sometimes dependent on each other. And they did this so as to offload onto the SPEs the debt load that they were accumulating, so as to fool the market into believing that Enron's debt was actually much smaller than it in fact was. Everyone knows what an entity is, yes? Does anyone know what an entity is? Okay, that's fine. Take legal environment of business. I think that that's probably covered in that class. An entity is simply a particular business arrangement that is formally recognized by the state. Pardon me. If you want to go into business with a business partner, the best way to do this for tax purposes and to establish formal legal recognition is to establish an entity. That can take different shapes. You could both be general partners. There could be one general partner and several limited partners. My dad some years ago set up a partnership to own, he owns a small dental office, right? And so he set up a partnership to own the land and the dental office. And I think I'm a limited partner in that partnership. Okay, Enron set up a bunch of shell companies were entities that were special purpose entities intended just to hold debt. And whereas Enron's debt, let's just make up a number, let's say 10 billion is the number here. It's actually much larger. Let's say 10 billion is the number here. Whereas that is the real number, they would offload this and hide it in the very special purpose entities. 1 billion here, 2 billion here, 1.5 billion here. They did this a bunch of different times so as to reduce this number and make it appear in the eyes of the public to be much less than it in fact was. Again, all with the intent of appearing to be a more worthy borrower and getting a lower interest rate on the money that they were trying to use to expand their operations rapidly. So those are the nuts and bolts of how it was done. More important, perhaps, for our purposes in this class than the actual nuts and bolts of how it was done is the psychology behind it. The psychology behind it. And like I said, driving all of this was a desire to expand the business too rapidly. It's fine to be ambitious, to expand your business quickly. It's not fine to cut corners in dangerous, risky ways that involve deception in order to do so. Enron's execs were incredibly ambitious. And that ambition actually spread throughout the company. And by the end, actually, several hundred people were involved in this. Most of the employees of the company didn't have any idea of the extent of the fraud that was going on. The company employed many tens of thousands of people. Most employees in a company that size just know what's going on in their own departments. They don't know what's going on in the company in general. But several hundred people did know. And when you look at those people and their behavior, especially towards the end, where Enron had to keep things going by borrowing more, the only way to keep the balls in the air was just to borrow more to pay the interest rate on what they had just been borrowing. When you look at the behavior of those people towards the end, it looks insane. You think to yourself, how the heck did these people think that this was going to continue as a going concern? And I think probably the answer there is that they didn't, or they weren't thinking that far ahead. They were just trying to keep the operations going for another 2 weeks or 3 weeks while they could squirrel their stock options away in the Caymans. I think that's probably the answer there. But in the end, it didn't work out at all, and it's a very tragic story. A lot of people went to jail. Some execs committed suicide. One guy shot himself in a park just a couple miles from HBU. Okay, it's a very, very tragic story. Does anybody actually have relatives or friends who worked for Enron? Okay, Enron was a big presence in Houston. The Minute Maid Park where the Astros play was called Enron Field. The giant E was one of the first things you could recognize when you saw the downtown skyline at night atop a very large building. Their name was plastered all over everything in Houston. They had a huge presence around the Galleria. And it was a kind of a pretty big deal when all this went down. Okay, the psychology is really interesting. And I'm going to direct our attention to the Sharon Watkins interview. We're going to do the Staubus and Stewart articles. I do want to go over those briefly. But I want us to look at the Sharon Watkins interview and see what her description of this is. She's the whistleblower in all of this. The person, really the only person in the Enron case who came through clean and blew the whistle on what was actually going on. And I apologize, I'm having a brain freeze. What page is the Watkins interview on? Let me look at the syllabus.
473, possibly. If I look in the book right.
473, I believe that's right. I knew it was right there at the end. Yes, there it is. Thank you. Okay, keep a finger in the Watkins interview. We're going to look at that in just a second. As I look at the Enron case, again, it staggers the imagination when you look at the scope and quantities of the fraud involved. There are all sorts of instances in American business where companies do limited fraud, but the scope and quantity of the fraud was extraordinary. And the only way, I guess, that I could describe it in terms of a mass psychological phenomenon is reaching to an odd source, but the animal world, and looking at a very famous little animal called the lemming. Okay? And I think basically what the Enron execs were doing is what lemmings do in the natural world. The lemming is a really interesting animal. Maybe you've heard of it before. It's like a prairie dog, okay, or a gopher. And lemmings normally just do their regular prairie dog thing. They burrow in the ground, and I don't know what prairie dogs eat. Worms, grubs, insects, who knows? Smaller rodents. But once in a while, a strange thing happens with lemmings. A few of them will just start running. And more of them will join them. And they'll all start running together. And more will join and more will join, until finally thousands of lemmings are all running together in a particular direction. And they will run full speed until they come to a body of water, a lake or the ocean sometimes, and they will plunge themselves in and commit suicide en masse. The lemming is known as the suicide animal. They will all plunge themselves in simultaneously and commit suicide. Okay, biologists speculate that maybe this phenomenon happens when there's overpopulation in a particular area, and so something enters their heads. But if you think about this phenomenon from the perspective of individual lemmings, maybe they don't think this far ahead, but I certainly doubt that they individually intend to commit suicide. Probably what they're doing is they're looking to their right, they're looking to their left, and they see other lemmings all running. And they think to themselves, well, everybody else is doing it. I might as well do it too. Maybe there's safety in numbers, or maybe they think to themselves, several thousand lemmings can't be wrong. And in the end, like it's catastrophic, right? They all die. You can actually see videos of this online. I think that I was going to show you guys a YouTube video of this just for kicks, but unfortunately I can only show PowerPoints on here. So look up the YouTube video on your own time. You can see lemmings running off a cliff in a YouTube video. Okay, but I think that that's what the Enron execs were doing. The several hundred people who knew about what was going on. I think towards the end there, they just kept doing it because they saw others doing it. And they thought, well, several hundred people can't all be wrong. And in a situation like that, bad ethics can be really contagious. And when others are doing it and appear to be getting away with it, and no one's stopping them, I guess our mindset as humans is, well, why don't I do it too? And in the end, several hundred people get involved, and it's truly extraordinary the level of fraud that it reached. Okay, nobody ever starts out in business ethics class in college thinking to themselves, I'm going to be the biggest corporate criminal in American history. That's my aspiration. No one does that. They sit there in business ethics class And they think to themselves, I'm going to do it right. I'm going to make lots of money, but I'm not going to run over people or commit fraud. I'm going to be honest in my business dealings. And then day by day, minute by minute, they make incremental choices, and those incremental choices alter their situations, like happened, I think, with the Enron execs. Let's look at the Watkins interview, and then I'll throw it open for questions or comments. Okay, so looking on page 474, this is an interview with Sharon Watkins. Mike Creighton, by the way, has told me that he thinks he can get her here to talk. She gives a lot of talks here in Houston. She's a well-known corporate speaker all over the world. And she's based out of Houston, of course. He thinks he can get her here to talk. I hope he can. I think that would be great. I think it would be a wonderful lecture. Probably her speaking fee is pretty high, honestly, so I'm not sure if he can. We'll see. Mike might be able to do that. Okay. On page 474, she says, first column, in 1996, the capital and trading division of Enron, run by Jeff Skilling, was on the wrong side of a gas trade and was facing a losing quarter. There were lots of meetings trying to figure out how the earnings shortfall was going to be filled. Okay, and then on page 475, so that's when things got started. At the beginning of the first column, she says, certainly I thought about quitting in 1996, but I had not yet made vice president. Back in those days, nobody in Houston would have believed you would leave Enron. Enron was the cat's meow up until 2001. You do not get hired as a director and leave as a director. People would think you were being pushed out. Okay, so she thinks about quitting, but she actually ends up deciding just to switch divisions initially. She knew fraud was taking place in a particular division. She decides to switch divisions and go to another part of the company, which I think is a reasonable kind of a decision. But then over time, she realizes that the fraud is widespread across the company, and it's in fact actually all over. On page 477, first column, the question is, near the end, when it became apparent that you were making some waves, what was the reaction of your peers? She says, actually, not many people knew of my meeting with Ken Lay. As I was planning to meet with Ken Lay in August of 2001, in that 5-day period between the all-employee meeting and my scheduled appointment, no one really knew what I was doing. During that 5-day window of preparation work for me, certain employees in the finance, control, and risk and accounting departments were very willing to feed me information. I think employees want to work for an ethical company. They saw things that bothered them and did not like it, so people were very willing to give me some spreadsheets, presentations, data, etc. Okay, so I think that speaks well of certain employees. Of course, the majority were continuing to go along with things. I think it's very insightful what she says on page 477 near the bottom of the second column. The question is, what advice would you give someone else in a position similar to yours? And I take it that position is a situation where you find fraud in the company that you're working for, and you're not a CEO, you're a lower down level employee. In her case, she was a vice president. So you can't really change it. She says, I tell college students, if your values are being challenged, get out, because you cannot change an unethical corporation unless you're at the very top. Pay attention to rationalizations. I think that's really sage advice. First, probably do what she did, which is ask to switch divisions. And then if you find that actually doesn't solve the problem, that there's still fraud going on in another division, then leave if you possibly can. Sometimes it's hard to leave. So actually, maybe counterintuitively, a way to strengthen yourself to be able to make good moral decisions in a circumstance like that is to build up a nest egg so that you have something to fall back on if and when you get fired for being a whistleblower or for refusing to participate. The absence of something to fall back on makes it very tempting just to go along with whatever's happening because you don't have any security. And she, in fact, only goes to leadership after she's got another job lined up at a different company. because she was so afraid of retaliation on the part of the management. Okay, and then on page 478, when she's talking about what Enron was doing, she uses this duck analogy, duck-dog analogy, and says basically what Enron was doing was it was trying to dress itself up as something that it was not. And that's what I was describing here, talking about the way they hid their debt, so as to fool the public into thinking that their finances were sounder than in fact was the case. Okay, let me stop and ask if there are questions or comments so far about this. Reflections, questions, comments?
Well, I heard, when I was taking accounting, I heard that they were shredding, like, all their papers and stuff.
Oh, yeah.
I think that was, like, towards the end.
Oh yeah, they certainly were.
Some people shredded everything, and
They're burning stuff, and like they had these mounds of documents they were all burning. They didn't want the government to find them out.
I heard that some people took there was, like, one guy that took a lot of the money.
I'm sorry?
There was, like, one guy that was, like, I don't know if he was, like, doing entries, but he took a lot of the money.
Yeah, right. Enron is a really interesting case because the execs at the very end all go to jail. But there are some execs who leave like 15 months before the end or 21 months before the end, almost certainly because they knew what was going on and wanted to get out. And some of those execs who left early actually were participants in the fraud. They just wanted to get out before the end, before the music stopped. And some of those guys actually made off really well because they didn't get jail time, and the government used them to testify against the others who they did want to give jail time. So, yeah, actually, I guess the moral of the story there is if you're participating in a widespread fraud, make sure you get out before the end. Let's turn the page and look at the Darley article. And I do want to still get to the Stewart and Staubus articles. I hope I can do that today. We'll see if I can. The Darley article is a very disturbing article to me, because the Darley article suggests that I too, in fact anybody, could get involved in corporate fraud relatively easily. So this is an article about the psychology of corruption and how it occurs. Seen in the clear light cast by hindsight, several related puzzlements emerge about the recent cases of corporate corruption. First, although such scandals may begin small, they often grow to huge and blatant proportions. Second, because of their blatant character, they seem suicidally stupid. They will eventually be detected with the inevitable disgrace that this will bring about for participants. Third, in their later stages, they come to involve a number of people in the organization who are busily involved in committing complicit actions that forward the corruption. On page 465 at the top of the second column, Darley outlines what this article is devoted to answering. He says, in this article, I will attempt to answer two questions that come to the mind of a psychologist who thinks about organizational corruption. First, why are so many initial corrupt acts taken in organizations? The answer cannot be that it is simply already corrupt people who take these actions. Part of the answer is that some of the people who launch these corruption-initiating actions do not scrutinize these contemplated acts from an ethical perspective. Strange as it may seem, they do not see them as unethical. Okay, let me pause there for a second. Actually, this is a really frightening prospect psychologically. Because when you look at most cases of widespread corporate corruption or fraud, the participants in them, many of them say afterwards, look, we never sat down and talked as an executive team about the prospect of committing fraud. They just never talked about it, and in some cases didn't really think about it. Many of these people who participate in this find participation in the fraud kind of like slipping off a log. It sort of happens to them, as opposed to being something that is intended. But reading on, the second question then becomes, why is it so easy to recruit other members of the organization to take the actions that amplify, extend, and continue these initiating outcomes to produce more and more corrupt outcomes? Okay, and on page 466, Darley talks about the initiation of corrupt outcomes. And in the Enron case, this would be the equivalent of the very first attempts to disguise the true nature of the debt load or to inflate the asset base in nefarious ways. Darley writes halfway down the page, we should also consider some more disquieting narratives which seem to suggest that the corrupt practices are somehow stumbled into without exactly being intentional. Okay, from this perspective, acts that start a chain of other actions that ultimately result in full-blown corrupt actions often have their origins in actions that are not themselves corrupt, or at least not perceived as so by the original actors. And that's the real frightening part of this article to me, is that many of the participants in large-scale corrupt enterprises find themselves doing things that happen just kind of naturally. Okay, how does this take place? Well, let's illustrate this for a minute here on the board. It takes place through a process that might be called the normalization of deviance. It takes place incrementally, gradually. So let's say here's position A, position B, position C, position D, all the way to position Z. Okay, and someone starts out here honestly, doing honest business, and maybe is under heavy pressure from higher ups in the company to achieve certain sales goals in a particular time period, like by the end of the quarter. And so they say to themselves, well, look, let's actually count toward our sales this quarter these receipts that are going to be closing 2 days after the quarter. Because after all, we've already got the contract. The customer's ordered them and will do it. It's just not going to close until after the quarter. And so they actually move from position A, which is an uncorrupted position, to position B, where there's a kind of an incremental change in their perspective. And then maybe they say after that, well, we'll start counting contracts that are closing 10 days after the quarter. And maybe after that they say, well, we'll start counting contracts that we know are going to close because the customer has verbally agreed. We've shaken hands on it. We know they're going to close, so we'll just go ahead and count those toward our quarterly sales. And since sales expectations have already been inflated by virtue of the now fraudulent inflated sales totals from previous quarters, they have to keep it going. If they don't keep it going, then it will be found out that they were fudging things in previous quarters. One thing that you find out when you tell lies is you have to tell more lies in order to keep others from finding out that you've been telling lies. And so there's a kind of a snowball effect to this whole process. And over time, right, somebody who never really at any point along the line intended to become this corrupt ultimately does get to position Z and is like thoroughly in a fraudulent enterprise. All because of incremental change. And the business psychologists call this the normalization of deviance. Part of this process psychologically is as you are involved in it, as you are at position B or at position C or at position D, what you're doing begins to feel more normal than it previously would have felt. So whereas initially at position A, the uncorrupted position, you would have been shocked by the idea of counting towards your quarterly sales totals, contracts that had only verbally been agreed upon, or only agreed upon through a handshake or something. You would have been shocked by that. But then as you gradually move down this corrupted track, when you find yourself, say, at position C, you're actually not comparing your behaviors there to what you initially would have considered to be ethical behavior, position A. You're actually referencing what you're doing to position B, in your mind at least. And you're thinking to yourself, well, what I'm doing here at position C is actually not that different than what I did last month or last quarter. And then you're here at position D, right, or whatever, and you think to yourself, well, what I am doing right now is actually not that different than it was last month or last quarter. And so over time, the deviance becomes normalized, and it begins to feel as though this is just the way you do things. Again, all of this happens incrementally. And that's what's frightening about the Darley article. And if you turn the page and take a look at his discussion of group participation in corruption, so that's the scenario for the individual. But group participation in corruption actually looks similar. Okay, at the bottom of page 468, second column, he writes, let me give you a metaphor. Well, let me read the paragraph prior to that. The next problem to solve is why these initial unethical actions so often seem to capture others in the organization, who build on, add to, and amplify the continuing chain of unethical actions. Then further down, let me give you a metaphor for what I want to suggest. Entrainment is a concept that comes from the early 20th century that I want to borrow for an organizational process. Originally, it referred to a perceptual phenomenon. An object is moving in one direction. As it passes other stationary objects, those objects themselves begin to move, and they move in the same direction as the original object. Okay, more and more people commit similar acts, often ones triggered by the original acts. And those subsequent acts often grow more extreme in their wrongness. Okay, so as this person initially who starts it gets going and seems to be getting away with it, and maybe his department in the company gets favored status and obtains more funding from higher-ups because they seem to be doing well, others notice this. They figure out what's going on, and maybe they too face temptations also to participate. And so others get picked up along the way. Okay, before long, you might have many agents who are all doing this. The reason why is because they see some getting away with it and succeeding and often being rewarded for the corrupt actions. Okay, humans have a tendency to want to pour money into what seems to be working well. Okay, that's a perfectly reasonable tendency. And if somebody's fraudulently inflating sales totals or claiming that their company is doing well when it's not, often money actually flows into that to reward them for the fraud. And others see them getting away with it, and they see this happening, and they join in because they too want to participate in the rewards. They want to get the rewards that come from this course of behavior. Until before long, you have the lemming-like situation, or the hundreds of execs at Enron who are all participating in the fraud together as deviance has become normalized in their minds. Okay, let me stop there and ask if there are any questions or comments about the psychological profile of this, of how it takes place. Do you guys think this is accurate? What Darley's saying? Do you think that it's something that, any of us could potentially fall prey to? Like, what do you guys think? Yep, Brinkley?
I think he's true because like where I work, like it's kind of like definitely like on a smaller scale, but like if anyone else like works, like like when you first start, like there's like you're probably like on top of everything and like you try to do everything perfect, and over time like you kind of like get a little lazier with things,
Mhm.
maybe not pay as much attention to it.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of like that.
Yeah, and of course that's nothing in comparison
Yeah.
to some of these larger corruptions, but yeah, I think that's been true of me in work situations that I've been in before as well. And like I've said before, guys, many times, ethics is really contagious. Humans just think socially when we think about our morality, and most of us tend to hold the moral opinions and engage in the moral behaviors that those around us are doing. That's just kind of the way humans seem to operate. And if we are surrounded by others who are all doing a particular thing, I mean, we kind of, I agree with this, actually, speaking personally. I think that this is right. Darley's right. I think that we kind of just sort of fall into this, and it happens to us. Okay, any other thoughts or reflections on this?
It's kind of made me think that people they get complacent and then they try to find shortcuts,
Yeah.
a different way to do something. Like, how can I do this to make it better? Or how can I do this so I can have a better profit or whatever?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I think that people do have a tendency to do that as well. And that probably feeds some of these cases for sure. Okay, good. I remember when I was a teenager. Actually, I wasn't a teenager. I was younger than that. I think I was 11. The neighbor girl had this really cool baseball card collection. This is back when baseball cards were big, before the baseball card crash. Okay, and I was so envious of her baseball card collection. I think looking back, she probably accumulated that from her parents because they felt bad about neglecting her, and so they helped her purchase a lot more than would otherwise have been the case. But I was so envious of her baseball card collection. I volunteered to sort her baseball cards for her. Okay, and she had some really good cards. And I skimmed some off the top, thinking, well, she's got several thousand here. She's not going to notice that they're missing. And I remember just squirreling them away in my closet. You just sort of get them out, I guess, and look at them and think how rich you are. And so her mother calls my mother a day later after I gave the sorted collection back, right? Her mother calls my mother a day later and says, Sarah says some cards are missing. And my mom confronts me. And I said, no, they're not. I was just going to sort these other cards in the special sorting. So that, she would appreciate that more, right? And my mom said, wisely, she said, well, I believe you, honey, because, you're my son, and I think you're telling me the truth. But let's just be on the up and up with her and just return the cards. Okay, well, I was not telling the truth. And to this day, actually, my mom doesn't know that I lied to her. When you tell lies, you have to tell more lies to keep people from finding out that you're telling lies. It's so crazy how that works. Until finally, you reach a point where you gotta either fess up or do some sort of cover up in order to make it all work out. Anyway, that's a story from young Jeremy's past life. Okay, let's look at the Staubus and Stewart articles. Oh no, we are at time, aren't we? I do want to get to those. Let me get to those next week. That's all I've got for today, guys. Sorry, no PowerPoint today. I was going to show you guys a PowerPoint, but we will save that for next week as well. Okay, you guys have a good rest of your day. Have a good rest of the Holy Week.